Hello. Today we have a special episode for Get to Uni where we have Karis, who is a first year student at St. Hilda's at Oxford University, who's doing a joint degree in psychology and linguistics. And we're going to take this time to understand a little bit about the course of psychology and the specific work that she does, as well as think about the interview techniques and things that you need to know when applying to Oxford. Karis, thank you so much for joining us on such short notice.
Thank you for having me.
So I'd love to first understand, because you're just giving a little bit of an explanation before we started the stream, of how the course fits in and how you're able to do a joint degree. So what's PPL about and what's EP about?
Okay, so if you're interested in applying to psychology generally at Oxford University, you have two main choices. You can either apply for a straight psychology course, which is experimental psychology, or you can apply to PPL, which is psychology, philosophy, and linguistics.
Hmm.
So out of these, in this PPL bracket, although there are three subjects under its heading, you choose two of them to apply to. So if you wanted to do psychology as part of your course, you could either apply to psychology and philosophy or psychology and linguistics, like I have. So then within this PPR bracket, essentially with psychology, you are doing exactly the same as the experimental psychologists do
Hmm.
when you get onto your course for the first year. The only thing that you'll have different is that you won't take the neurophysiology module. But apart from that, everything that you do as a PPL student will be exactly the same as the experimental psychologists do, generally speaking.
And why did you end up doing a joint degree rather than a pure psychology one?
So, like from a young age, I've been brought up with this sort of fascination with languages, I guess.
Mm.
So I did both French and German for GCSE, and then continued German onto A level, though I did like French in my sort of spare time.
Hmm.
I think that mainly comes from the fact that my mum speaks both French and German, not as a native speaker, but you can see that I've been brought up with this kind of appreciation for learning a second language,
Yeah.
a third language, and this sort of wonder at different cultures and things like that. And then linguistics seemed a nice choice because it both allowed me to keep on admiring languages, even though like one of the sort of misconceptions with the linguistics is that it's speaking another language or you have to know another language. And although it's
Mm.
very beneficial, you definitely don't have to. Like a lot of more of what you're especially doing in interviews is analyzing different languages and using what you know about other languages to bring on side. So I guess I chose the joint degree because I loved the sort of logic and the patterns that happen in language. And I'm especially interested in how like language acquisition and how we learn languages, not just as a child, but also as bilinguals or if we're learning second language
Mm.
later on in life. And then also that I just loved psychology and I taught it for myself A level and I found it fascinating. And I think it's one of those subjects that once you know more about, along with the linguistics to an extent, like it changes your view of the world because you see it everywhere.
Yeah.
It's just so applicable.
Of course. I'm a mathematician, but I still do admire linguistics very, very much. I'm like fascinated by etymologies of words, and when you look at the origins, you're like, wow, that's so incredible to see how the interplay between spoken and written languages and see what happens. Anyway, my fascinations aside, I would. So obviously, you had the opportunity to do this dual degree, essentially, right? And that's not something you can often get. So, what other aspects of this degree at Oxford is special? And I know you're still in your first year, but what are you most excited about?
So I think the main advantage in my head of doing a dual degree, apart from the fact that you get to do two subjects and therefore you sort of have a wider view and a wider knowledge than
Hmm.
perhaps you would if you just did experimental psychology or like another single honors degree. I think the other thing is that especially with psychology, philosophy, and linguistics, there is an awful lot of crossover between the three,
Okay.
and between whichever two you will choose.
Mm.
So even things like psychology and linguistics, even though you might on first glance only think the thing in common they have is psycholinguistics, so this language acquisition, actually there's a lot of different crossover between the two, and the skills you learn for one will be really important for the other. And it'll be really interesting because the way that I'll approach questions on like language acquisition, being someone who studied psycholinguistics this term in
Mhm.
my linguistics classes, my general linguistics classes, will be very different to the way that an experimental psychologist will try and explain language acquisition, because although there'll be crossover, there'll be different information that I have from studying linguistics that will feed into my knowledge, and also different skills that I've learned on the course. So I think studying the joint honours degree definitely gives you a wider expertise and sort of a nice opportunity to see different things in each subject which you haven't thought of before. And the same thing goes for philosophy. Even though I don't do it as part of my degree, there's like definitely things with the philosophy of language. And then in perception, you know, for psychology, I'm studying perception at the moment. There's a lot of stuff on the philosophy and perception. And obviously you've got things like fate and free will, which are very philosophical questions. And they all like beautifully link together, that the more you read into it and the more you sort of get tangled up, I guess, in one of each of the subjects, the more obvious it becomes on why they paired the three together, and why whichever two you choose will work really well.
Yeah, there's a symbiosis between them. You actually had quite a good kind of footing when it came to your subjects at A level. So you had done a few subjects in languages, you were doing psychology, and you studied on your own. What surprised you when you came to the course? Was there something that was like, oh, I did not expect to be studying this, or I did not expect it to be taken in this way?
That is a good question. I think linguistics was the one that surprised me the most, not necessarily because like any of the topics were surprising to me, because obviously I'd done some research in advance as to what would be covered, but more in the way that no one really studies linguistics before you get to university.
Yeah.
So anything that you learn in there is surprising. And because it's all completely new, like you learn one thing one week and then you'll learn a new theory next week, which goes in contradiction to the one you did the previous week. But not in a way that like gets frustrating, but more in a way that it allows you to see like the sort of beautiful intricacies of the subject. So like with linguistics, as well as doing things like sociolinguistics, which would fall under general linguistics, we call it in Oxford, which is one of our sort of 3 modules for the term. We also do like grammatical analysis work with syntax and morphology and things like that. And then also we do phonetics and phonology. And I think the thing that surprised me the most in regards to the course is like how quickly you pick things up, I guess. But then I think that's part of being in Oxford and being a very intense course, especially with dual honours. Like
Yeah.
phonetics and phonology especially is very quick, but like not in a way that's intimidating necessarily, but more in a way that you surprise yourself at how quickly you start to pick things up. And I guess as well, like not necessarily what surprised me on the course, but also like how even within 2 months, I moved in on the 4th and it's now the 3rd of December. So
December,
I moved
yeah.
in 4th of October. I've been here just less than 2 months, and I'm already starting to see things differently. Like I'm already listening to people speaking and thinking about how they pronounce words and how I would
Yeah.
write that in the IPA and things. So I think it's quite surprising in a way, like how much you immerse yourself in your subject without realizing.
That's very cool. And I want to pick up on something you said, which is the kind of the special nature of Oxford and its intensity as a course. So, of course, there's a collegiate system at Oxford, which is why you're at St Hilda's. That's obviously very special about the university, but also there are many other kind of differences. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and how you've found that experience of being at Oxford?
I mean, the collegiate system in general, I think, is an amazing thing to be part of. And it's worth saying, like, that no matter what college you end up going to, whether it's one you directly applied for, or whether it's one you ended up at, or whether it's one that you did an open application and they like gave you an offer for, you will end up loving your college. And there's a lot of friendly college rivalry in sports and things,
Yeah.
and just in general with meeting new people that really makes the system fun, I think. And it's
Yeah.
also a lovely opportunity to meet people who you're going to be living with, and meet people from a variety of different subjects,
Yeah. Yeah.
who will like always be in the same kitchen and things, and who you can like coordinate to go offsite with next year, or If you're going to stay in the college for accommodation, then you can arrange for your rooms to be next to each other. And I think the collegiate system is really special in fostering this community in college. Aside from the collegiate system, things that are special about Oxford in general, I think matriculation has to be a big part of that. So matriculation is the ceremony that you have when you come to Oxford, technically a few weeks after we had ours, and is when you officially become a student at the college and at the university. So in a way, it's quite weird because you join the university, you do Freshers Week, you do a week or maybe 2 weeks of studying, and then you officially become a student. So it always feels odd because you feel like you've officially become a student 2 weeks ago.
Of course.
And that's a really special ceremony, I think. And you'll get dressed in your subfasks, so the very typical Oxford uniform, I've heard it called, with your white top or black skirt and a black tie or a white bow tie and a sort of typical tie for girls, and your gowns. That's a very Oxford thing, I think. And that's a really special occasion where you all go to the Sheldonian Theatre. They say a few lines in Latin, then the Vice-Chancellor gave us a speech, and you come out of that. And I think that's the day that I've been in Oxford where it's most felt real. And you all take photos by the Radcam or the Radcliffe camera for not trying to use Oxford jargon. And it's a very special moment. And I think that's one of the, not is a thing that is something that's going to happen again and again in your course, because you'll only have it at the start, unless you obviously go on for postgrad or something like that. But it's one of those things that is part of your Oxford experiences, and matriculation at other unis sometimes is just signing your name down and saying that you're there.
Well, I don't think we even had one. So you feel just skipped over that. What about the kind of extracurricular activities? So the collegiate system does provide, and I think that's amazing, where you get that interdisciplinary feel to it all, right? Because it's great to be on a course, but having friends from other courses also shapes you and informs you of the different perspectives on life. What other kind of societies, extracurricular activities are on offer, and which ones have you kind of taken part in?
There is a whole host of societies in Oxford. I think even if I would be surprised if there is not a society for something that someone wants, and if there isn't, then there is always the opportunity to create one. So we both have societies in our college, which tend to be quite sports based, if they're very specific to college. We have a sports college netball and a college rugby team. And I think we also have some specific poetry societies and things in college. And then on a sort of wider scale, you also have the sporting societies in general in Oxford, a whole host of, the typical netball, rugby, football, rowing, obviously, very typically Oxford, kayaking, canoeing, dance sport, octopus, Quidditch, obviously, as well.
Wow, of course.
All the different martial arts, taekwondo, judo, and things like that. And then aside from sporting societies, there is also a whole host of things that you can do. So they've got the language societies. So for example, a friend of mine is in French society and I go to German society. I went to my first in-person event with them yesterday, which was a lot of fun. And because as part of my degree, although I use German, sometimes I don't speak German in it. It was a lot of fun to be able to speak German again. It was really nice. That was a good opportunity as well to meet people from other colleges and in other years as well. And there's also non-language based societies, you've got general subject societies, I've done some stuff with Psychology Society, or there's Geography Society or Socrates Society for the philosophers. And all the sort of different subjects you could imagine. With international students, there's obviously specific societies too that you can go to, or the Christian Union or the Hindu Society and different ones like that. And then also ones that are very hobby based rather than academics or culture or religion. So like there's role-playing society, there's quiz society, like there's a lot of just different fun ones that you can do if you want a break from like the very academic ones. I think it's quite easy when you go to something like Freshers' Fair at Oxford to be like, okay, I need to sign up for Psychology Society, I need to sign up for Linguistics Society, and anything that will help with those, because you get into that mindset of
Everything
academics
to do
being
with your course.
yeah.
Yeah.
But then I think it's always nice to have something which isn't related and it's just like a bit of fun. And like no matter what you're into, there is almost definitely a society in Oxford for you. And if not, as I said, then make one, because I'm sure there'll be a demand for it.
Amazing. So I think I want to move to the next part of our episode, which is it's just going to focus a little bit more on the interview. Of course, there are not many universities, but Oxford and Cambridge are one of them. Are one of those which require an interview once you apply, and they tend to be quite competitive. There's a lot of training, and lots of schools actually support you in those processes, but many international students and many students may not have access to this, so we're really grateful for you to share the experience you had through the interview process, but also share your insights and advice for new applicants as they go into EP or the joint program, or in general to Oxford. So maybe broadly, could you tell us a little bit about what the interview system is like, and then we can kind of dive deeper into the technical questions.
Okay, so for your interview, if you've made a specific application, then sometimes you'll be offered an interview at that college. So it's quite normal for you to be either not offered an interview at that college and be offered an interview at a completely separate college, or perhaps you'll have an interview at that college and a different college. So you can either have that offered straight away, or sometimes what they'll do is they'll give you an interview at one college, and then some subjects will decide to pull you for another interview, maybe a week later, and you'll get a notification of that too.
Okay.
It's worth saying that, like, whether you've got an interview at the college you applied for or what college you get called for an interview at, like, that isn't reflective of anything to do with you. That is just how some subjects decide to do it.
Okay.
So like just because you haven't got an interview for the college you applied for doesn't mean that you're not as good as a candidate as someone else. It's just to do with individual colleges and individual subjects as to how they're doing things that year. So for example, with mine, I had 4 interviews. So I had 2 at each college for each part of, well, not each college, but I got interviewed for both St Hilda's College and Jesus College, for each subject. So I had 2 psychology interviews, one at St Hilda's, one at Jesus, and then 2 linguistics interviews, one at St Hilda's and one at Jesus. So as you can see with me, I had one for like the specific college I ended up at, and then one as a sort of extra college who I could
Yeah.
also be chosen by.
Yeah.
But then also, like, it's quite often as well that you can have an interview at 2 colleges or an interview just at 1 college, and then you'll be given an offer for a completely separate college. Again, that's not indicative
Yeah.
of anything. That is just, dependent on the subject that year and how the colleges want to play it, because they'll have in mind sometimes a certain amount of people that they want to have on their course.
Got it. Yeah.
So
Makes sense.
like this idea, I think there's sometimes an idea around certain colleges, like if you get called to a different college and called for interview at a different college, like that's indicative of you not being good enough at the first college. But that's a complete myth. It's a lie.
Okay.
It's just
Okay.
all dependent on how the colleges want to do it that year. So do not get fooled into thinking that you're less worthy of a candidate if you don't get an interview for the college that you originally applied for.
Thanks for debunking that myth. And so how does the interview look like? Because it isn't one where you're kind of like going for a job interview, right? It's very technical.
Yeah, so all of the interviews tend to follow the same rough format,
Okay.
obviously then breaking off into specific things for each subject. So they'll often start with an icebreaker question, and this can either be something on the written work that you've done, if you've had to submit written work for your course, or something that you've mentioned in your personal statement, or it can be something completely general. So I didn't have to submit any written work for my course. So I never had any specific questions on that. But I did have questions on things that I'd written in my personal statement and on things very generally. So, for example, in my psychology interview, they would ask, like, oh, if I could conduct one experiment with no limitations, what would it be? So that had nothing to do with my personal statement. That was just them wanting to sort of break the ice, get me speaking, and also get an idea of where my interests in psychology lie, I guess. And then depending on the subject, they will take it different ways from there. So some like subjects will just talk about written work you've done for your entire thing. Generally, the more common structure that I hear is that your interview then is divided into two parts, with like one part of the interview focusing on one skill and one scenario perhaps, and then the other part of your interview will focus on a different skill, a different scenario they want to test you on.
Okay.
So, for example, in my psychology interviews, I would often have one part of it being designing a test for something that they've asked me to do. And then the other part may be analyzing data and seeing how good I am at forming hypotheses and then adjusting my hypotheses depending on new data that they gave me. But obviously, that's something quite specific to psychology, but it wouldn't surprise me if similar skills are tested in other scientific subjects. And then again, for linguistics, they followed the same rough structure, not necessarily in analyzing data and things like that, but also with the two halves of an interview after the icebreaker questions being
Yeah.
two different skills that they would test.
So describe the logistics for us a little bit. So how many people are in the interview? Is it a small room, a big room? How long does it last?
So all interviews this year are online, as they were with
Okay.
me
Okay.
last year. So the shortest interview I had was 20 minutes,
Okay.
and they never lasted longer than half hour generally. So I'd say 20 minutes, half hour. For my subjects were generally standard interview times. Uh, it's obviously just you in your interview as the applicant, but generally speaking, you would have two, maybe three professors or tutors in the sort of interview room with you. So that would either be in person if you were a previous year, or maybe next year they'll have it like that as well. But also in the Zoom room or the Microsoft Teams room, you'll tend
Sure.
to have two or three tutors there who will take turns in asking you different questions. And often what will happen, as you might expect, is that while one of them is asking a question, the other one will be taking notes, and
Okay.
then vice versa.
Got it.
Um, and sometimes what they'll do as well is that depending on each tutor's sort of interest, is that they will take different parts of the interview. So, for example, in one of my psychology interviews, one of the questions I was asked was quite similar to one of the tutor's research and like connected really well with that. So she asked me all the questions to do with that because that's what she was interested in. And it made sense for her to ask the questions on that. Whereas in other subjects, they might have just done alternate questions. It doesn't really matter particularly either way, but that's generally
Yeah.
what the format will be. And obviously, don't freak out when they're typing notes, because I'll do that for every candidate, whether you have a really good interview or a really bad interview. So
Okay.
I think in a way that's quite nice with looking at the screen and everyone being online, is that you can't see them physically writing notes. It's a bit more subtle in a way.
And in terms of the questions, are they always so we always get kind of on social media and myths of like, oh, Oxford and Cambridge interviews are super hard or the questions are really difficult. What are they trying to do there? Are they always that difficult, or are they trying to kind of probe your perspective and your thought process more than your answer itself?
I think it would depend on the subject as
Okay.
to how difficult your questions will be. But generally, I panicked a bit when I was reading through some of these Oxford questions, or the Oxford and Cambridge interview questions. I'd like to say that most interviews will not have questions like some of the stupid ones you see online.
Yeah.
Like I had no questions in my interview which I could not answer at all. You know, like you sometimes see things like, oh, one side of this brick is warm and one side of it is cold. Explain why one of it is warm, one side of it is warm, and you've got no idea, and you're sort of grasping in the dark.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, But like in most interviews and in the interviews that I've heard from other people, there are generally no questions like that. The most complicated ones I've found are in philosophy, but you might expect that because they're not so much complicated, but they're all on philosophical questions. So you have to
Yeah.
sort of, they're more abstract in a way.
Yes.
Whereas
Yeah.
in my interviews, all of the questions that they asked were ones that you could answer. And even if
Hmm.
you had no prior knowledge of the subject, because you don't have to for psychology or you don't have to for linguistics, like they never expected you to have to do anything abstract or have to bring in loads of new knowledge, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
They were always things that you could have a grasp at. They were more testing skills and testing how you could adapt to their questions than they
Yeah.
were like actually testing your knowledge of the subject.
Sure. That makes sense. So, how would you prepare for such an interview when you're a little bit unsure what the questions would be like, and the because this is very different from, for example, an A level exam, right? You know you're gonna have some definitions, some case studies, some essays to write. This time around, you have very much an open book.
Yeah. So I think generally across the subjects, the main piece of advice that both Oxford will give you and that I can reiterate is getting used to thinking out loud. You know, take questions, ask your like friends perhaps to ask you some mock interview questions that you can find
Hmm.
online and explain with them through your reasoning. Because I think often with A level, you're so used to writing things down and making notes that you like don't lose the skill, but you never have an opportunity to have this skill of explaining through what you're doing every step of the way. And if you encounter
Yeah.
a problem in your interview and you realize something that you've done previously was wrong, or perhaps that there's something in there that you didn't consider and that you should consider, then say, even if you've moved on to the next question, like you can go back and say, oh, actually, no, I think about it on reflection, this is what I would have done.
Hmm.
Because it's better to do that than not say that you realized you were wrong at all. And in a way,
Yeah.
that's something that the tutors will really appreciate, because they'll be like, okay, she can recognize when she made a mistake and she knows how to adapt on that. You know, so for one of my questions, I had to design an experiment and I was in the middle of designing the experiment, and then I like went, oh, but I don't know whether my experiment that I've designed is actually on remembering things or whether it's on recall. And actually then that shows them that you have a really intricate knowledge on the difference between remembering and recall, and then you
Yeah.
like tease out very specific things on how you would go about testing the difference between that and making sure your experiment reflects what you actually want to test rather than this other one.
Mm.
So as well as thinking out loud, I think generally going through past questions is really beneficial,
Hmm.
and being able to look at data and continually change your mind depending on what is presented to you. So, like, you can go through with a friend and you can state your opinion and have someone just continuously play devil's advocate. And if you're maybe applying for psychology, like, I'd always suggest like a friend asking you to come up with a theory for why something might happen and then continuously tell you that your theory is slightly wrong and this piece of data may indicate that, and then change it to do with a random piece of data.
Yeah.
You can make
Yeah.
up the data. It's just that skill and being able to not change your mind completely, but adapt to the situation. That's
Mm.
something they'll really be interested in, especially in the scientific subjects. With linguistics, again, very similar with thinking out loud and also sort of changing your mind depending on what information you're given. But also, it's really beneficial, I think, if you're doing linguistics, is to like look at the past MLAT papers and the aptitude tests, because you don't have to sit that anymore, but that is very similar to the stuff they may give you in an interview, and getting
Gotcha.
used to how language patterns might work and maybe doing some language patterns and trying to solve problems in your free time. That's like a nice little way to prepare, and I found it quite fun when I did that. So that's what I would suggest.
That's very helpful, and that's very kind of technically sound pieces of advice as well. I'm sure people who are applying to those specific degrees will find that very useful. We have been having quite a long chat, so I wanted to round it off and ask for your final piece of advice as a current student, but also as an applicant. What would you kind of share with aspiring applicants today?
If you haven't applied yet and you're applying
Well,
next year or
maybe those have applied already and are like
okay.
are in the stages of interview or kind of close to that.
One, don't panic. Like Oxford is a really, really good in like university. And if you get an interview, congrats, because that is a huge achievement in itself. If you don't, Oxford is not the be all and end all. Like you have to see it as just a redirection. And if Oxford like decide they're not going to give you an interview, that is not the end of the world. And I know it may not feel like that, and you have a right to feel upset. But you are going to be equally amazing anywhere that you go. And there are benefits to not going to Oxford. You know, Oxford is amazing, but so will be many of the other places that you apply to. If you do get an interview, well done. Stay calm, be relaxed, and have faith in what you are saying. And if you get something wrong, acknowledge that, because it may seem intimidating being in a room with tutors online, even, and thinking that they are the best in their subject, which they often are. But these people are also human too. They've also
Yeah.
made mistakes too. And sometimes, like, tutors may not even do as well as you had done in interviews when they were your age. Like,
Yeah.
you have to know that if you do make mistakes, like that is perfectly reasonable and perfectly understandable, and they're not expecting you to be perfect. They're not expecting you to know everything. You just need to have fun at the end of the day. What they're looking for is that you love your subject and that you would work well in the tutorial system. And what will make sure you do well in the tutorial system is that you have this perseverance and that you show your love for the subject, because that will be what, through like sometimes a very grueling 8-week term, that'll be what gets you through it, and that'll be what they're
Yeah.
most interested in, as
Yeah.
well as these skills. So I think just have fun with it, don't panic, and like take the opportunity, because if you don't get an offer, then like it's amazing that you got an interview in the first place, and that was a once in a lifetime experience. And again, if you don't get an offer, then fine. Like it's probably upsetting, and I understand that. But Oxford is not the, if you don't get an offer from Oxford, that is not the end of the world, and you have to see it as a redirection rather than rejection, as I so often hear. So I think
Amazing.
just have fun with it all and enjoy it, because it's a once in a lifetime experience.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Karis. This was super insightful. I'm sure many, many students will find it very useful. I hope you have a lovely day and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Bye.
Bye.